we go. All right, it's around 2:02, so I'm going to get started with our pretty basic admin that we've got. So welcome, everyone. My name is Erin Calhoun, and I'm a member of the NASIG Continuing Education Committee, and I want to thank the NASIG Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee for sponsoring today's webinar entitled Creating and Implementing an Inclusive Metadata Policy. And before we get started, I have a few Continuing Education Committee announcements. After the webinar, you'll receive a link to a short evaluation form and a link to the recording and slides. I'll add a few links to the chat here, or one of my NASIG committee members will, where you can find the webinar archive for other NASIG CEC webinars on the NASIG webpage, and also archived recordings on YouTube. So next month, we will have a webinar for Digital Preservation 101, 404 No More by our Digital Preservation Committee, and it will be May 7th at our usual 2 p.m. time slot. And with that, I'll pass things over to Rachel. I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Hi, everybody. My name is Rachel Melton, and I am a member of the NASIG's Equity and Inclusion Committee. So a couple of housekeeping things. We're going to ask that during the presentation, if you could just submit your questions to the question and answer module. We will monitor those, and we will have a section at the end of today's presentation to address those questions. If you aren't familiar with Zoom, that's okay, and you want to post it in the chat, I am going to be monitoring the chat, and I will grab those questions and make sure that we ask Jeremy and Nicole at the end of this. So I recently attended a symposium on reparative metadata and description and access. And one of the Indigenous speakers there, Melissa Isaac, she started her presentation with a greeting that I would like to echo, though I will do it in English. So welcome, my human relatives, and thank you so much for joining us here today. We are so excited to have you. We're excited to welcome Nicole Lewis, the Metadata Standards Librarian from the Brigham Young University Library, and Jeremy Myntti, the Associate University Librarian for Metadata and IT, also from the Brigham Young University Library. And they're going to talk to us about their process of creating and implementing an inclusive metadata policy. And before I turn it over to the presenters, I did want to take a moment just to emphasize how important it is to create and maintain these types of policies, especially in our current climate. I want to encourage everyone to not only not comply in advance with being asked to remove and deprioritize this kind of work and these initiatives, but to actively continue to prioritize them. The solidarity that is cultivated by creating and maintaining these policies is an important form of resistance. It is up to us as individuals and as organizations and institutions to steward with integrity, especially in the face of blatant epistemicide, which means the destruction of knowledge. And that's currently occurring, and it includes the erasure of data that highlights or simply acknowledges the disparities and oppression experienced by marginalized groups. People who are working towards and valuing truth have no need to destroy or obfuscate data or information. And by creating and implementing these policies that respectfully represent and highlight marginalized groups, the ways they wish to be represented, we participate in a crucial method of using our privilege, power, and position to lift up those who are currently being violently erased from our knowledge sets and from our society in general. So I just wanted to say a big, big thank you to Jeremy and Nicole for doing this work and for sharing their knowledge with us today. May we all continue to learn, grow, and move together toward a truly equitable society for all. And without further ado, please take it away, Nicole and Jeremy.
Great, thank you so much, and thanks to everybody here for attending today. As was mentioned, I'm Jeremy Myntti, and I have with me Nicole Lewis. We're both from the Brigham Young University Library, and we're just going to be talking today about a project that we have worked on for the past few years within our library to create and then implement an inclusive metadata policy. So in this presentation, I'm going to be talking about the efforts that led up to creating this policy. Then Nicole will talk about the policy itself and the creation process, how it came to be. And then at the end, we'll share a few ways that our library has been working to implement this policy. But before we really jump into this, like Rachel started off with, I just want to acknowledge the landscape that we are in right now. It's a challenging time, and there are many questions as to how we can continue projects such as the one that we're going to be talking about. But this is such important work that we need to continue along into the future. So first off with that, I just want to say thank you to all of you for attending today. This goes to show that you are committed to continually moving forward with this necessary and important work. Since Nicole and I are at a private institution, things can sometimes look and feel a bit different for us, but we are greatly affected nonetheless. A few weeks ago, Nicole, as we were preparing for this webinar, Nicole sent a few questions to our university's Office of Belonging to get their thoughts on how we can continue with these efforts to ensure that our metadata is inclusive. And in response to those questions, our Associate Vice President for Belonging responded by saying, quote, "It is difficult not to be affected by the day-to-day changes that are occurring because of the current political climate. We lead with belonging and all that it entails by showing that we value diversity so that the work can continue," end quote. So throughout our work on creating this inclusive metadata policy and at many different points in its implementation, we have been consulting with this AVP from our Office of Belonging just to make sure that we do stay in line with the university's stance on belonging. So with that, let's jump into our presentation here. So a few years ago, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, BYU had a university committee that made a recommendation to university administration to create an Office of Belonging, like I've mentioned. So this office was officially formed in 2021, and it's led by a new Vice President of Belonging who serves on the university's President's Council. This office has expanded over the past few years and now includes, I believe, 12 full-time administrators and staff, and then also many, many student employees. And over the past couple of years, this office has helped in any belonging type question. They've offered many events throughout the year, throughout the academic year. They support many different initiatives across campus, and they work with many different colleges and departments on different belonging projects. Just a few examples of some of the events or projects they've worked on. Every semester, they hold a taco bout belonging for grad students to eat tacos and talk with members of the Office of Belonging and how that applies to their grad study programs. They partner with our counseling and psychological services to provide the QPR training. That's the question, persuade, refer, the suicide training. They partner with several areas of campus each year for different Dia de los Muertos events, including a really large ofrenda in the library. And this coming year within our library, we're hoping to make that ofrenda bigger and better than ever to celebrate our university's 150th anniversary. And then they also host many concerts, talks, dances, what have you, things that students would want to attend related to Black History Month, Women's History Month. Any event like that, this office is helping the departments to put on. So the biggest event or the biggest effort of this office so far was in creating the BYU Statement on Belonging. So since BYU is a private religious institution, you can see that this statement is supported by scriptural references along with the university's mission statement. To create a community of belonging among all campus students, faculty, and staff, there are these 4 principles that they like us to think about and apply. So you see the second principle on this statement says, "We value and embrace the variety of individual characteristics, life experiences, and circumstances, perspectives, talents, and gifts of each member of the community, and the richness and strength they bring to our community." Based on this, we've come up with several different initiatives within our library that we would be able to do to support our university's efforts on belonging. So in early 2022, our library's Archival Processing, Preservation, and Access Committee started talking about how they could implement a reparative language statement within our finding aid repository. The statement that they created was originally focused only on special collections metadata, but we decided to broaden that statement to cover all library created metadata. And this statement is now displayed in the footer of every page of our archive space instance. You can see it at the bottom of this screenshot here, and it just says, "The BYU Library aims to create descriptions of collections that are inclusive and support an environment of belonging. If you encounter language and finding aids, catalog records, or collection descriptions that you find offensive or believe to be harmful, we invite your feedback at this email address. So right now, this statement is currently only on our archive space instance, but we're planning different methods and ways that we're going to be able to add that kind of statement to other areas of metadata, our library catalog, our digital collections repository. So we hope to be able to add that statement to those in the near future here. Soon after implementing that statement in archive space, our library decided to recreate our metadata management committee, which had been inactive for the previous few years. Here you can see a little part of that committee's charge. So the purpose of this new committee was to document, educate, and recommend a common implementation of metadata standards and practices across library systems that facilitates the discovery and access to acquired library information resources. And then through the responsibilities there, I believe it's the second to last one, it says to investigate new metadata standards, projects, and initiatives that could benefit future metadata work in the library. So for this committee to accomplish those types of tasks, we wanted not only representatives from our cataloging and metadata department, but we also wanted representatives from other areas of our library who are the consumers of this metadata. So since the work that we're reporting on in this presentation has had contributions from all members of this committee, we wanted just to give a quick shout out to the members of the committee to recognize their efforts. So the 4 members on the top of this slide are people from our cataloging and metadata department, and that department also includes our archival processing section. And then the other 4 members on the bottom of the slide, they're representatives from other areas of the library, such as a special collections curator, a subject librarian, an acquisitions manager, and an IT software engineer. So once we had this committee up and running by the end of 2022, we needed to decide what their first projects to work on would be. So here at BYU, there's a high level of resource planning across the entire university that occurs early every year to start planning what we hope to accomplish in the following year. So in early 2023, we were planning what the library's annual priorities for 2024 would be. One of our library's strategic objectives is to provide extensive and convenient access to challenging high quality information. So with that strategic objective in mind, one of the 2024 annual priorities that we decided to focus on included 2 major projects, belonging through Library Collections Task Force and then developing a policy for inclusive metadata. The work in creating this inclusive metadata project really began in early 2023, but as is often the case with these types of projects, it takes a considerable amount of time and work to create and implement any policy. So the goal in our strategic planning that year was to have the policy approved and the first stages of implementation completed by the end of 2024. So with that in mind, one of the first tasks that the Metadata Management Committee was assigned was to take that reparative language statement that was created by the other committee and just to see how it could be expanded to create a library-wide inclusive metadata policy that was in harmony with our university's statement on belonging. So now I'll pass it over to Nicole, who was chair of that Metadata Management Committee, to talk about the creation of the policy.
There we go. Thank you, Jeremy. So I'm going to talk through the general process that we followed, and then I will provide some examples from our actual policy and recommendations document. Some of these are pretty text heavy, so just know that the slides will be given out later. So don't worry about frantically taking notes or worry too much if I'm talking too fast, but hopefully I don't talk too fast. So as we began our process of reviewing of trying to create our inclusive metadata policy, we started with research. That's what librarians do best, right? So we spent several months reviewing existing resources and presentations on inclusive cataloging and metadata. At this point, there had already been movement in this direction. So there was actually quite a bit for us to consider as we took on this project. A couple of presentations that initially helped for us was the reparative description hosted by the Society of American Archivists, as well as an implementing inclusive metadata, which was a panel hosted by NISO. These were both in 22 and early 23. And then there was a number of online resources, and this is just a sampling. We looked at quite a few others, but the Cataloging Lab's statements on bias page, there's a still growing list of links on that page. The Harvard Guidelines for Inclusive and Conscientious Description, a Duke Library's blog post, and then UNC's Guide to Conscious Editing from their special collections. We tried to really, because our metadata focuses not just in cataloging, but also in archival description, we tried to make sure we looked at kind of both sides of the issue according, based on those two areas of metadata and description. As we reviewed these resources and research, as a committee, we started noting general concepts from those that we thought might be good to include in our inclusive metadata policy. Some of these concepts included cultural humility, how to develop it, or what is it even, how to determine what terms to use. There was a lot of different helps in that regard. How do we incorporate patron feedback? What do we do about new metadata versus all the existing, millions of records of, millions of catalog records that already exist? What do we do about that metadata? How are we going to acknowledge past practice and provide some transparency? How can we incorporate accessibility? And then certainly we wanted to tie in the library's strategic directions. After we had our initial list, we went back to also review the university's statement on belonging, and that second principle, which Jeremy already pointed out, regarding the variety of characteristics and experiences that bring richness to our community, and how could we incorporate that into our policy and procedures, documentation. And after we had done all this research and made some initial thoughts, we really started diving in and initially, we needed to determine the scope because, like most libraries, we have metadata that we control, so our catalog records, finding aids. But then there's a lot of metadata that gets harvested in our discovery layer from other sources. And those obviously, are difficult to control in many ways. So since we excluded them, we wanted to include some sort of instructions for how to report potential issues to those vendors or other sources of metadata. And then we had to determine, like, what do we do about the random metadata creators? So for the most part, metadata creators reside in our cataloging and metadata department. However, some of our faculty librarians can do and have done research and created databases that also reside on the library's website, but aren't directly controlled by our department. So how do we handle those situations as well in this policy? So we really tried to, take a wide view lens on all of the metadata within our library. Once we had our concepts and our scope, we started dividing up the concepts amongst the committee, and each person got one and started drafting a policy statement. This was a very iterative process. It took about 3 months to kind of go through various drafts. And as we were going through the process, it became clear that policy statements are pretty limited, and a lot of us wanted the practical kind of how do I use this, in my work. And so it became clear that we needed a companion document for the policy, which we started calling it, well, and have called it our recommendations for application of the policy. So it became clear we needed sort of two things to come out of this this project. Once we had our initial drafts of our policy statements, we sent it through or up to library administration to comment on. Their comments were really helpful and brought about further refinement. Our definitions weren't good enough. Like, coming from a cataloging standpoint, we kind of use certain terminology and it wasn't, broad enough for just anyone in the library. So it helped us to revise better definitions. We ended up consolidating our policy principles from 6 to 4. And then they asked us questions like, how do we ensure that metadata creators practice cultural humility? That was one of our principles. And what do we use as trusted terminology sources? And that's, certainly sources for things like that isn't something you put in a policy, which kind of reinforce the need for that companion document. And then questions for how do we ensure consistency across metadata creators? How do we ensure that each person is applying the policy equally or as consistently as another? So lots of good things to consider. After that initial feedback too was when I reached out to the Office of Belonging to get their thoughts, to explain the project. And I met with one of the AVPs over Belonging, had a really great discussion. She gave us this incredibly better definition of cultural humility that was tailored to our religious community. But also we started talking about plans for ongoing training to be provided from their office on cultural humility. At that point, we started drafting the recommendations document as well as doing further refinements on the policy draft. As part of the recommendations, we sought different vocabulary and community guideline resources. Again, like the work of others hugely helped us in this regard because so many people had already been actively engaged in this work. And so we're standing on the shoulders of giants. So so it goes. And this whole revision process took another 4 months of work. So it wasn't anything that was quick by any means. But after that time, we had another draft of the policy as well as the recommendations document ready for review. And we started with our cataloging and metadata department, which has most of our metadata creators. Really great feedback from that department, from our colleagues, mostly editorial suggestions. And the feedback was generally positive. And I've put a quote here from one of my colleagues just to show, not everyone in our department was familiar with it. And so there was a willingness certainly to want to engage in this work and to learn more about it. So after these suggestions were received, it took us about another month to review and revise. And then we had our semi-final, let's call it, draft to submit to library administration. And I also sent it to the Office of Belonging. Some of the comments that came back from this one, how would we determine the preferred terminology of the community? What does cultural humility look like in practice? And then what principles determine what patron feedback we accept or reject? So we hadn't sufficiently addressed these points. And so we made more revisions, discussed those issues, took us another month. And then we had a final version ready for review by library administration, which ended up just being, a few wordsmithing comments and further definition clarifications. And then they accepted the policy and the recommendations document with those particular edits. So just to briefly go through our policy now, as it was finalized, this is kind of the final version that I'll show you here. This was our purpose, just kind of reiterating again and tying into our library strategic directions, as well as the statement on belonging. And I'm not going to, these next slides are going to be pretty text heavy. So, again, I'm not going to read them word for word. Then we had our scope. So just that it applies to metadata in the resources where we control the metadata. And we listed out what those were, and that it does not apply to the harvested metadata. We made sure that that was clear there. In our definitions section, we had 10 words. So the first 5 being cultural humility, harvested metadata, inclusive, legacy descriptions, and metadata. Again, just trying to make sure we're tailoring it to a general library community, not just the cataloging department, making clear what we mean by all these things. And then the last 5, metadata creator, metadata steward, person first language, preferred terminology, and remediation. And then we had our 4 guiding principles. The first one relating to being intentional and conscientious in our description, and to practice cultural humility and engage in regular training. Second one pertaining to some specific inclusive description principles, such as person first language and preferred terminologies, and that creators should refer to trusted guides. The third really just states who will maintain the recommendations document, and that people who are outside the cataloging and metadata department can adapt it for their own particular situation. Like these are the metadata outlier folks that they should coordinate with the cataloging metadata department as they apply those principles. And then the fourth being that the library will maintain avenues for patrons to submit or request reviews of description. So that's kind of the promise on the library's side, to keep the phone lines open, if you will. And then we included a provision that the policy would be reviewed every 3 years by the committee to ensure compliance, and then the references to our for our definitions and our purpose. So this is generally how our recommendations document ended up being. So first being how to submit changes to non-library controlled metadata, a section about cultural humility, another section about terminology, how to prioritize remediation, and then handling patron requests for review. So I'll go into each of these in a little more detail. As far as getting to those external resources, we just acknowledge that we need to submit support tickets to vendors for consideration. We are a fully PCC library. We participate in all of the programs. Subject heading, obviously SACO is the most applicable in terms of being able to control anyways. Yeah, you know what I mean. I'm losing my train of thought here for a second, but we have a SACO coordinator in our library, and if we find subject headings to update, we should work through that program. Our cultural humility section included a lot of resources to help on an individual level, mostly for resources where an individual could go and learn more about cultural humility, like a LinkedIn Learning course. There's the University of Oregon Cultural Humility Toolkit, and there was several other things. This is just a few. But then we also put in this section of our recommendations that the Office of Belonging would provide a training session. And this was based on my initial conversations with the AVP of Belonging, the first of which we had, and I'll talk about more of this later, but we had last February. So we put it in here that we would have that training once every 2 years. And so in not too much more time, I'm going to start scheduling that for our next early next year to have our second cultural humility training. The section about terminology, we just included examples of each of these things, the person first language, avoiding assumptions and ethnicity, gender. What do we do about retention of offensive language? So this is primarily applicable to archival description, like how do we acknowledge that without, how do we frame the context of our creators or donor supplied metadata? And then we included a number of links to resources for preferred terminology and other guides for communities, particular communities. Basically, in our priorities section, we just told metadata creators that they should develop priorities and workflows to identify and remediate insensitive legacy description. Each person's metadata stewardship is slightly different. A cataloger would go about this much differently than an archival processor might. So we didn't want to be completely prescriptive here, but leave it open to the individual creators to define that as is most appropriate for their work. And then after, after all of this was done, this was our friend at the Office for Belonging, Lita Little Giddens, was a huge help for us. This was just to quote her feedback on the policy and the recommendations document. And as you can see, just as you briefly, skim it, like nothing but glowing words. And that really meant a lot to us as a committee to feel like we were producing something that would help further not only the work for the cataloging community, but that it was helping our BYU community as well. And with that, I will turn it back to Jeremy.
All right, so now that we had this policy created, we need to figure out, okay, what does this really mean in practice? So we came up with several different projects for implementing this policy. So here on this slide, we just have 6 different projects that we're going to talk about in the next several slides about how we've been implementing the policy. So first off are some revisions that have been made to our archival processing manual. You can see this quote here. It's from an updated section of that manual that just talks about how general notes at either the collection or inventory level should be used to be able to document issues or changes within these records. This policy manual includes many examples of how to phrase revision notes for internal tracking purposes, as well as processing notes that would be displayed to our patrons. So an example of how this applies is with the photograph you see on the left side there. The original title for that photo was based on the inscription from the back of the photo, which said, "Typical home, Indian girl and sleep companion at home, photo and copyright 91 by Grabill." So using principles from the policy, this title was then updated to John C.H. Grabill photograph of Oglala child in front of teepee, and subject access was added for the preferred name of the tribe, the Oglala Indians, and then the geographic place name of the region, the Oglala Sioux tribe of the Pine Ridge Reservation, South Dakota. And then when these updates are made, the changes are noted and documented in notes field, so we know how we got to the point of having that in our metadata. Soon after the policy was approved, it was time for our annual staff evaluations. So with this policy in the forefront of everybody's minds, there were many goals that people set that were in these annual evaluations for how the individual employees in the cataloging and metadata department could learn more about cultural humility, or find ways to implement reparative language best practices, or just to really learn about and explore what this policy is going to mean in practice. And then if you remember back to one of the first slides in this presentation, you remember that we added that short blurb at the bottom of our archive space instance that gave patrons a method for reporting any potentially offensive or harmful language that we could then review and update as necessary. So within the past couple of weeks, our Library Administrative Council has approved this updated statement that we have titled "Fostering Belonging Through Library Descriptions." This longer statement will soon be on our cataloging and metadata department's website, and will then be linked from all collection and item level records within our various discovery systems. So the statement that we had in archive space will be updated to have a link to this here where people can get a little bit more information. The statement was also one of the things where we sought feedback from our university's Office of Belonging from Lita Little Giddens. And when she reviewed the final version, She just said that she was impressed with this public statement and loved that it links back to the university's statement on belonging, just to make sure that the library is staying in line with what the university is going for.
Okay, so another project that we took on was involvement in the Mormon to Latter-day Saint heading change. This was something where the Library of Congress had received a request to change this heading, and they reached out to our librarians to help assist in updating the term. It was a collaborative process with not only us and the Library of Congress. I'm going to forget what it stands for, but the PTCP or group. Apologies if any of them are here. Between them, also the American Theological Library Association, Community of Christ, who's another denomination in the Mormonism movement or Latter-day Saint movement now, as well as the libraries and archives of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. The result of this was that nearly 450 subject headings changed in the Library of Congress subject heading vocabulary from Mormon to Latter-day Saint in its various iterations. And then the follow-up work for that with those heading changes in our catalog were that we had to change nearly 50,000 headings in our catalog to the new versions. And there were additional heading changes that were needed in our digital library and in our finding aids. Some of that was done manually, but as much as possible, we did do batch updates to those headings. So thankfully, we didn't have to do all 50,000 plus one at a time. As I mentioned earlier, we got Lita Little-Giddens to come and do a cultural humility training. This was a year ago, February, for our first iteration. It was very well attended. And the training itself took about an hour and a half. It was very engaging. I mean, she is just amazing. But it was a combination of looking at what cultural humility is, what it isn't, talking about experiences to recognize experiences for each of us where we might have been able to show cultural humility or not. So there was reflection involved in this. It was really an incredible training, and I'm really looking forward to next year's second iteration of this. And the feedback that I received from having the AVP for Belonging come to give this training was it was very well received. Everyone enjoyed it. Everyone felt like they learned something from it, and I think it was a great way to engage not just metadata creators, because we did kind of require it for them, but we had subject librarians, special collections curators, and other staff all around the library in all areas come to attend this. So it was something that benefited the whole library, not just our metadata folks. And then I know a lot of libraries have already done this kind of thing, updating old cutters from the end cutters and other cutters that had been updated in LC classification. But this was something else that was undertaken as well to update. Of course, it updated them in the records and then updated the labels, and then they needed to be shifted on the shelves as well. Not a lengthy process. I don't think we had a ton of these, but certainly well worth getting things classified in under the correct cutters. And with that, we will say thank you for attending and listening to our presentation. We have included a link here. We wrote an article that was published in the, now I'm not going to remember the acronym because I'm on the spot, library, Jeremy, help me.
In library resources and technical
services. Okay. Which is an ALA core journal. This is a link to an article that we've written about this whole process and these projects, so you can review that for further information as well if you wish.
Then I also just want to say at the end of these slides here, when they are sent out, the full policy will be shared in the following slides. And then also, if you look at this article, the full policy is there as well as our recommendations document, so you can get more information with that. And yeah, with that, we'd just like to thank everybody and open it up to any questions.
So I don't see any questions yet, but there's still time for them to trickle in, and I might as well ask one. So you mentioned how you wanted to ensure that metadata creators were practicing cultural humility and like that it was being done consistently across the different creators of this metadata. So is that mostly done through your annual evaluations, or can you talk a little bit more about like how you are still monitoring that kind of information?
That's a very good question, and one that we really need to figure out still. So like you said there, we have our training that we'll do every other year and invite anybody from the library to come to that, but require our metadata creators to come to it so they can continually keep that on their mind. But now we need to figure out, okay, how do we track that? How do we ensure that people are applying these principles, and really what body should govern that kind of effort? We're not exactly sure there yet.
Definitely a tricky thing to have to do, so hopefully we'll get updates from you all as you all figure that out and navigate it. So we do have a question now. What has the patron feedback been like?
That's a very good question, and the patron feedback has been very minimal up to this point. So I mentioned that we put that statement on the bottom of Archive Space nearly 3 years ago, I believe. In that time, there's only been a couple of emails that have been sent through that email address, mostly things not related to what we were hoping to receive from that. Most of the feedback that we have received on potential updates to metadata records have really been internal to our library. So even with that, it's good. We have a large library with 150 full-time employees, 450 students. So just pushing this kind of information out to that core group so that they can be reviewing metadata and suggest updates where they see fit has been good. But even with that, it has been relatively little that has been submitted. A lot of it has been people that are creating the metadata, noticing issues themselves, and then making the updates.
Thank you. So this one is a little bit of a comment as well as a question. So it says, I have faced some slight resistance / hesitation at my institution to adding an offensive or harmful language statement on the library website. The reason being to not draw unnecessary attention to the fact. Any advice on how to advocate for that? Not being able to do that so far has not impeded my work on reparative cataloging, but I do still think it's helpful, transparent, honest to notify patrons of this reality in more a public sense. So again, the question being, any advice on how to advocate for these kinds of statements?
That's an excellent question, and one that I'm sure is on everybody's mind, especially with the current situation that we're in. If you've noticed throughout this presentation, we continually refer to belonging because that's the stance that our university took a few years ago. Belonging isn't one of those terms that is being targeted at the moment, so we have felt lucky to be able to continue with that, keep pushing this forward in a belonging effort, even though it is very related to other things and other terms that might have some or trigger terms for people at the moment. I'm not sure what else to say other than, yeah, I don't know. It's a hard question to deal with at the moment.
Absolutely. So were there any specific challenging situations that you could maybe tell us about just in how this whole thing went down? It sounds
I'm
like
not
you
sure,
didn't get a lot
Nicole.
of pushback from your administration, but were there any like surprising challenges maybe or situations that you could just address for us?
Yeah, when administration reviewed it, like you said, there wasn't a lot of pushback, but we wanted to be very careful in the wording choices that we made in the policy and all the documents and anything that we put out there. As for challenging situations with implementing the policy, I'm not sure, Nicole, do you have any examples of when the policy has been implemented in different situations that has been tricky to navigate?
Um, I know that for our archival processing section, they tend to come across the real hairy stuff. And I think I feel like I've heard, so this isn't, don't take me on this necessarily. I feel like they've had some discussions, like lengthy discussions with the curators on um, wanting to apply certain things, but not necessarily like it taking time, I guess, to get them on board. I can't think of a specific example. I think the archives are the main place where there is, though, the more tricky stuff. Maybe I'll have to check out and see. ask them later and see if they have any examples.
Excellent. So we just got another question. Do you have any plan for the Gulf of Mexico / Gulf of America, or are you going to address this to the committee in the future?
That's an excellent question, and we have a meeting scheduled for next Tuesday to discuss that. So we'll see where that discussion goes.
All right, another question. Might you speak to any community outreach you took regarding terms? That was a literal reading of that question.
I think so far, the main community that we've kind of worked with is our own, that I'm aware of. I don't know, Jeremy, if you're aware of any others. But just in the Mormons to Latter-day Saint change, making sure to reach out to the different denominations within our faith group to make sure that we were accurately representing them as well, in updating those terms, is the only thing that I'm aware of.
Yeah, that's the major one that I can think of as well. And was glad during that process that it didn't really start within our library. There was another large library, I can't remember which one, that created a SACO proposal to update that. Once the Library of Congress saw that, they immediately came to our library. Many of you may know Bob Maxwell. He was the one that did a lot of that work. He spent a lot of time on his weekends because he enjoys it so much, just making all of these updates to authority records to be able to work with the library that originally submitted the request, the Library of Congress, other faith denominations, and there was another group, I can't remember which, but that was the big one that has happened in the last 2 years.
And I think too, like in this regard, is where we've also benefited just from the work of our, peers at other institutions. There's so many communities out there that, have been misrepresented, and no one library can do it all. And I think that the efforts of the community to work together in different areas, has really benefited all of us in this. So I'm grateful to them.
All right, well, it doesn't look like we have any more questions for you all, so thank you so much for your presentation and for answering our questions. I'm gonna throw a link in here to an open access book called Knowledge Justice, and I think everyone here will probably have an interest in it, so if you wanna go to that link, you can. And otherwise, I'm gonna hand this over to Erin for wrap up. So thank you all for joining us.
Hi, sorry, it took forever to find the unmute button and get it working. Thank you for this wonderful presentation. I'm just going to share my slide for a moment here. And there we go. So thank you again, Jeremy and Cole, for this really great presentation. On this really important topic, and thank you to the NASIG Equity, Diversity, Inclusion Committee for sponsoring this webinar, and thank you to everyone for joining us. We ask that you please share your feedback with the CEC by filling out the evaluation form, which I will put into the chat. Very bad at multitasking on Zoom, and to also check out our nasig.org webinars, webinar archive as well, for notice of our future webinars, which you can see on the screen here is our digital preservation webinar coming up in May. So thank you again all, and I hope you have a great day. The evaluation form will be in the chat, also in the email that you'll get after this webinar. All right. Thanks all. Take care. And if it's rest you, I'm going to stop the recording and I guess end the webinar. I have to figure out how to stop the recording, so it's going to take me a moment. Karen, you will receive links to the slides from the NASIG email shortly after. And I believe it might include the webinar also.